Believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see. Hello there, everybody, and welcome to None of What You Hear. It's just me, Robin, telling you my stories of pop culture's most infamous legends and lore with a dry sense of humor and some observations on why we love them. Or at least why we can't look away. Don't get up on my account. No, in fact, I recommend you cozy up and buckle up. We've got a lot to get to today with our tragic, unbelievable, and infuriating conclusion of our series detailing the troubled life of Marilyn Monroe. And once again, I do want to put out a gentle word of caution that we will be dealing with some potentially sensitive subject matter, including pregnancy loss, drug and alcohol abuse, sexual abuse, severe mental health and depression issues, and suicidal behaviors. I won't be getting graphic with it, and I'm still dedicated to creating a listening experience you won't have to spend an hour explaining to your kids if they happen to walk into the room. But I've personally found looking into this stuff to feel heavy at times, and it is adult material. So, with that out there, let's dive back into part 2 of the amazing and anguished life of Marilyn Monroe. A tepid gust gently disturbs the fog on the rolling hills lining the north shore of Lake Tahoe, straddling the California-Nevada line. In the wee hours of the morning, dawn breaks to find a beautiful legend of the silver screen swaying back and forth gently at the edge of a pool, with a vacant and disturbed rhythm of implausible self-soothing and an unyielding distant gaze toward the top of a nearby rocky hillside. What she sees may very well be a ghost, an apparition of a beautiful friendship complicated by a confused version of love, or maybe some kind of visual manifestation of regret. Or perhaps a guardian angel that was unable to reach and protect her in time. But after what she's endured throughout her life, specifically in the last few hours of darkness, nothing really quite makes sense or adds up the way it's supposed to anyway. And Marilyn Monroe would be dead just 1 week later. When we last left Marilyn Monroe and Arthur Miller in their lovely East Midtown Manhattan apartment, the hopes of an expectant family had crashed catastrophically with Marilyn's traumatic miscarriage. She and Miller make a 180 on the power couple vector and retreat from New York City hustle and bustle to seek peace and recovery in the solitude of an idyllic upstate farm. Though Marilyn does once again sink into a deep melancholy, far from the mental health assistance she had become so committed to and in desperate need of now, they really do seem to settle in and find a comfortable domestic groove within their rural simplicity. Miller would begin to work on what would become the script for Marilyn Monroe's final film, The Misfits. No, nothing to do with Glenn Danzig, get your mind out of the gutter. Within the story, Miller was integrating a perhaps way too close-to-home role based on Marilyn's true life for her to play in the film. Meanwhile, Marilyn slowly and gradually began to devolve from dedicated farm housewife to lethargic barbiturate junkie. She would retire to the solitude of her bedroom early in the afternoon to lose herself in the familiar sounds of Frank Sinatra and Every Day I Got the Blues by B.B. King. Well, eventually the blues got her and she fell victim to her second major drug overdose. Miller was able to steal himself away from the typewriter just in time to revive her and seek medical attention. Speaking of bad luck and trouble, Marilyn sure had her share. This begins an era for Marilyn Monroe where the many trials of life, love, loss, and addiction, along with her struggles with severe mental illness, were finally beginning to wear away at her gusto, drive, and overall spark. Her desire to prove herself in business and artistic craft begins to wane. She begins to surround herself with people she would prefer sometimes make important decisions for her. And in the leech-laden entertainment industry, that's a slippery and dangerous slope. At this time, the proxy role is happily and somewhat expectedly filled by her doting husband, who is also now caretaker. And Miller commences reviewing scripts and the accompanying financial arrangements for her next film. In some ways, she's always wanted a man to take her under his wing and care for her. And I don't question Arthur Miller's motives with regard to the Hollywood leech comment. I'm just saying Marilyn's establishing a pattern of relinquishing personal control as her troubles with addiction and mental health begin to take more of a leading role. But, even having said all of that, the troubles are still far below the surface and the public pretense. And the show most definitely goes on. Her next film, Some Like It Hot, goes box office smash, and Marilyn Monroe pens another iconic role into her film legacy. She personally hated the role of all-girl jazz band leader Sugar Kane and fought direction in an almost childish manner, but ended up hitting it out of the park even with the many pitfalls of her notorious tardiness and unreliability on set. The cast and crew had few kind words for the process, including an often misconstrued comment about kissing Marilyn Monroe being akin to kissing a Nazi. But no one seemed to complain when the checks kept rolling in. Miller, however, worn down by the grind of being in a now very codependent marriage and business arrangement, withered to a shell of his former death of a salesman in crucible glory. The filming process seemed to have a pattern of putting an incredible strain on the relationship, but he was still well taken care of by Marilyn Monroe Pictures for his work on the Misfits script, even if his wife still continued to seek romantic solace in the arms of the now senator from the great state of Massachusetts, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, such as an account of an alleged quickie tryst in conjunction with a rare promotional trip to Chicago for the release of Some Like It Hot. Even going back to the story of the Mediterranean yacht party in part 1, both seem to have developed this go-to stress coping mechanism of seeking solace in each other to relieve the pressures of political and movie star greatness. Or maybe she just truly loved the imminent president-to-be, who some already believed to be using her. Jack had always maintained to Marilyn that his marriage to Jackie was out of a shade of political obligation, an East Coast socialite royalty arrangement for keeping up with the all-too-important appearances. But he insisted to Marilyn that she was his one true flame, and, stop me if you've ever heard this before, that he would be more than happy to divorce Jackie and make Marilyn the princess she was always destined to be just as soon as the time was right. But JFK brother-in-law Peter Lawford had often considered Marilyn to be just another trophy in Jack's collection. Whatever the true case, the flame Marilyn had always kindled for the dream of Camelot Princess was finally overtaken by the wildfire of rumors spreading that JFK was making a run for the presidency. And the idea that a good Irish Catholic from Boston would even utter the word divorce would not play well on the campaign trail or in the press. And never fully coming out of the fog of miscarriage anyway, another loss of hope sent her deeper into the oblivion of the old show business scissor of barbiturates dissolved in champagne we spoke of earlier. Enter Dr. Ralph Greenson, Marilyn Monroe's new psychiatrist who had already cultivated the deepest of Communist Party contacts Miller was only on the fringes of many times removed. Greenson first comes into contact with Marilyn in between film jobs and in the throes of a perpetual drug-induced stupor, set off by Marilyn's despondency over Jack's presidential candidacy run. He assesses that the source of her troubles is severe anxiety stress due to her tumultuous relationship with Jack, exacerbated by the fact that any doctor Marilyn Monroe would so much make eye contact with was more than happy to write a prescription for pretty much anything she whimsically fancied, including, at this time, Demerol, sodium pentothal, or truth serum in old-time movie speak, phenobarbital, and amytal. He also noted in Marilyn a venomous resentment toward Miller. Greenson would end up wedging himself into a commandeering role in Marilyn's life and even play a pretty large one in her untimely death. But his motivations appeared to be on the level, at least at first. And in turn, Marilyn found in Greenson a, quote, Jesus, who gives me courage and makes me feel smart and makes me think, according to her personal recollection. Which sounds to me like the help she'd always needed to find these things within herself through thoughtful talk therapy and psychoanalysis. But that's just my hopefully humble armchair quarterbacking opinion. Many, many years on down the line. Obviously, I'm not in charge of what happens in anyone else's mind, even the most legendary movie star to have ever lived. So then, anyway, with Greenson either intentionally or unintentionally capitalizing, a term his communist leanings would despise, on Marilyn's reliance to him, a fault in the seam had turned into a fault line in the geography of the Monroe-Miller marriage. And by the time Marilyn struck up her obligatory off-screen romance with Let's Make Love co-star Yves Montand, the seismic activity would prove to destroy the already faulty foundation, effectively crumbling the fated union. And with the tethering from Miller she had seemingly taken for granted, now gone, Marilyn enters a time in the throes of addiction and mental health struggles where she is at the complete mercy of her own flawed judgment of character, shaky moral compass, and the sordid motivations of the colorful characters she now begins to surround herself with. who, if you have any previous acquaintance with the remainder of our story, you'll likely recall do not always or even often have the best interest in mind or intentions towards the former Miss Normajeane Baker, orphan number 3463. The race for the crown, the race for the presidency was just getting fired up when Marilyn Monroe saw the 1960 ball drop on Times Square, if she remembered. Family patriarch Joe Kennedy had just purchased his son a private jet, and smoky backroom politics were clouding the races for the swing states across the nation. JFK had long maintained a friendship with Frank Sinatra, but now he began to rely on the larger-than-life crooner's mafia connections to help move the needle in his campaign's direction. Specifically with Chicago boss of bosses Sam Giancana. And as we all know, hopefully not from personal experience, it's never a one-way back-scratching when La Cosa Nostra is involved. A mutually beneficial arrangement was cultivated wherein Kennedy would be assisted by Giancana's union connections to shift swing state votes away from Nixon. If, in turn, Kennedy, should he secure the nomination and presidency, would see through to wield the almighty axe of U.S. power to fell the Cuban Castro regime. The flood of mafia casino money from a pre-revolution Havana had made the Las Vegas take look like a wishing well by comparison, and they wanted and needed it back. Sam Giancana had Kennedy's hamartia, or fatal flaw, on lock like any exploitative gangster worth his salt would. And for JFK, in fact, most of the men who shared the name Kennedy, that was women. And in the case of the senator from Massachusetts, one of his main vulnerabilities came in the shape of one particularly beautiful blonde movie star from California. So with Sinatra as the common denominator between Marilyn Monroe, the Kennedys, and what would prove to be a dangerous and in cases deadly relationship with the mafia, also deep in the mix as a former ratpacker married to Jack and Bobby Kennedy's sister was Peter Lawford, who was setting up somewhat less of a West Coast campaign headquarters as the LA debauchery and beach house party zone far from Cape Cod and the Kennedy wives, where he would be able to attain and serve up the Kennedy vice and remain relevant in his own special way. He's once to have tastefully said, "I'm not going to talk about Jack and his broads because I just can't. And well, I'm not proud of it, but all I will say is that I was Frank's pimp, and Frank was Jack's. It sounds terrible to say now, but back then it was a whole lot of fun." Yes, Peter, it does indeed sound terrible. And that's just where things get started with the stand-up role Peter Lawford is about to play in our tale. FBI surveillance files from around this time corroborate much of the time spent between Sinatra, Lawford, and Kennedy at the Sands Hotel in Vegas, where JFK does not seem to be concerned about keeping a clean nose literally or figuratively. Sands Vegas is also where former Marilyn Monroe associate from the bus stop days and close Kennedy contact Patricia Newcomb is making her way back into the mix, where she will remain until the very bitter end. It was surprisingly she, rather than Sinatra, who convinced Marilyn Monroe to join JFK's growing list of celebrity endorsements. Not that it obviously took too much convincing to do something Jack wanted, even if it made her ultimate dream of marriage to him more unattainable, even in her tender state as a result of the foiled prospect. And in a twist of dumb luck for our whole third act crew, the 1960 DNC convention was about to be held in Los Angeles. Surrounding the convention, there are said to have been numerous sightings and accounts of clandestine meetups between Jack and Marilyn, including one that has Jack skittering down a fire escape to a waiting car. Jackie, it may be implied, did not attend the convention. It had actually become an odd pattern that whenever there was a chance of seeing Marilyn, Jackie was nowhere to be found. And as we know, John Fitzgerald Kennedy did clinch the Democratic nomination for President of the United States at the 1960 convention. What we didn't know is that it was said there was actually some on-the-floor mafia strong-arming to make sure that happened. After the acceptance speech, Big Pimpin' Lawford threw Jack a raucous celebration at his beach house where JFK and Marilyn were seen canoodling by witness of the bartender. And when the last bottle was drained dry and the last noodle was canoodled, Jack went back to a gassed-up campaign, and Marilyn went on to begin filming what was to be her last movie of a long and storied career of acting, stardom, and Hollywood iconography. A dream team on paper with famous director John Huston at the helm. And finally a chance to work with a Hollywood legend Marilyn had once mistook a photo of her own father for, Clark Gable. The power trio of a cast would be completed by Montgomery Clift. Arthur Miller would be supervising the script he had written, with the role of Rosalind cut straight from the cloth of Marilyn's own life for what was designed to be a tailor fit. The couple were not officially divorced yet, and though the marriage was in name only, things were not amicable between the two, and the tension created a built-in pressure cooker that came with the hot, dusty desert location. Additionally, Marilyn was once again deep in Barbiturate Bay, and even the camera picked up on the strange, spacey look in her eye, which was noticed by all. Her addiction proclivities were not positively aided by the hard-drinking cast and crew, including Gable, who is said to have been drinking around 3 quarts of whiskey at the time, and Clift, who was barely coherent most of the time due to his own deep addiction issues stemming from a car accident in the mid-50s. None of these troubles made for a smooth production and were further exacerbated by Marilyn's chronic tardiness, which is a really big deal in the film industry. You have literally hundreds of people standing around waiting to shoot a few minutes of your performance at a time. And the preparation to do that, especially with an on-location hot desert shoot, is mind-boggling. And the most important component to set all the gears in motion is simply that you are where you're supposed to be when you're supposed to be there. Though Gable was ever the constant perfect patient gentleman while Marilyn was present, he was known to have shown extreme irritation at her unreliability and unprofessionalism when she was absent. Now, usually even a rocky production would ultimately render anything Marilyn Monroe touched to solid gold. But in the case of the Misfits, the waters were much too muddied for anyone to feel they'd walked away with a product they were proud of, and by the end of the experience, all parties involved were at some kind of odds with each other. Which is why, when Frank Sinatra invited the top tier of actors and directors to a Misfits production party / grand opening of his new Cal Neva Lake Tahoe Elite Super Retreat, Gable insisted that he would only attend if the entire cast and crew were invited. Sinatra agreed, and also to be in attendance Sam Giancana, Johnny Roselli, as well as Jack and Joseph Kennedy. Nobody will ever know for sure exactly what transpired through the weekend, but whatever mysterious events took place had a devastating effect on Marilyn. When the production resumed on Monday, she was seen to have been anxious, disturbed, upset, and very out of sorts. And not too much later, once again, she was found and saved just in time from another overdose in her hotel room. Aided by Kennedy through Lawford, she was made sure to have been hand-delivered to the constant care and supervision of Dr. Ralph Greenson. And once she was blessed and anointed as recovered by Jesus Greenson, Marilyn returned to Nevada for a short time to put the finishing touches on filming The Misfits. When all was said and done, The Misfits would go on to be a failure of a production as well as in the box office. With the Miller divorce now finalized, so would her third marriage. We can pretty safely assume that the OD after Cal Neva likely had something to do with Jack, especially considering his personal proactive hand in getting her back to Greenson. And with all that weighing her down, Marilyn Monroe would once again be found in a deep, bedridden depression back home the day John Fitzgerald Kennedy was inaugurated 35th President of the United States. JFK was greeted by an old friend his first day in the White House. With enough dirt on the Kennedys to plant a corn maze, J. Edgar Hoover was soon reappointed the head of the FBI. And seeming almost as a countermeasure, JFK appointed his brother Bobby, who had never practiced law and had a sparse political background, as Attorney General. Marilyn is seeming to be on the mend from her crippling loneliness and failure, but begins to exhibit a pattern of behavior that would stick, wherein she somewhat aggressively demands time with Jack, possibly using her own dirt or fragile state after the mysterious Cal Neva goings-on as personal leverage. That's not so clear, and it's more of an observation, but the power dynamic definitely shifts now that Jack's in the White House. And what is clear is that her old secretary and Zelda Zonk disguise and alter egos would be spotted on numerous occasions at the presidential yacht and Air Force One in the early days of Camelot, in spite of JFK's previous protests and attempts to keep Marilyn at bay. She even had a Secret Service codename assigned, Miss Green, for presidential calls and visits. Knowing her proximity and sway with the Kennedys, particularly Bobby, Marilyn broke down and rehired Pat Newcomb, now as full-time press secretary and part-time pill pusher. And she would be very busy with both. One of the first PR messes she would attempt to wrangle was the public perception that Marilyn Monroe was somehow to blame for Clark Gable's massive heart attack that led to his unfortunate passing. Because it couldn't have been the near-constant smoking or three-quarter-day whiskey habit, but rather Marilyn stressing him out to the brink of destruction with her on- and offset antics, tardiness, and unprofessionalism during the Misfits filming. Well, the press sure thought so. And though news cycles do what they do, and Pat Newcomb handled it fine, the idea that the world perceived Marilyn was somehow responsible for the death of one of her personal heroes was how she entered the holiday season of 1961. Holidays, as we've seen, are hard for Marilyn, with a particular sting resulting from the lack of a father figure, which we also know she had subconsciously always fancied Clark Gable as. After the botched visit to see her birth father years ago, Marilyn had made only one attempt at communication after she was embraced by fame. Once again with devastating results, when Stan Gifford only spoke through his wife to convey that he never wanted to speak with Marilyn, and that if she needed something from him as the world's biggest movie star, she could contact his lawyer, which was much to her confusion and devastation, as her overall motivation was just to share the benefits of her success with the people, at least on paper, who were called her family. So again, hopeless for the holidays, she turned to Joe DiMaggio for some comfort in mutual misery. And he was happy to oblige by bringing some gifts and spending Christmas with his lost love. And even if the motivations were murky, the pair, who would always been better friends anyway, found some temporary holiday peace. But the peace would be short-lived in light of the Misfits premiere in the new year. The film, as we may have been expecting, met a wishy-washy response from the critics and the public. And going back to a character she had hated but that was curated for her by her ex-husband Miller, as well as the accompanying memories of the traumatic experiences during the filming, not to mention seeing the personal hero she was blamed for stressing to death back on the screen, and whatever mixed emotions that brought with it, all culminated in sending an already fragile and teetering Marilyn back into full breakdown mode. Under emergency advisement from her old New York psychiatrist, Dr. Chris, she was committed to Cornell Medical Center and remanded to a padded cell reserved for the most critically disturbed patients. It was almost a moment-for-moment reenactment of the hellish nightmare she had woken up from stuttering in a cold sweat next to her photographer friend during her modeling days so long ago. And the more disturbed she appeared at the realization of her own nightmare, the more severely the staff reacted to her increasingly violent outbursts. She was eventually fitted with the dreaded straitjacket and kept in the padded room with it on for 48 hours. It's still a little unclear why the hospital staff saw her and treated her as such a threat, and taking their very old-school methods into consideration, it was probably a pretty safe bet she was not even thought to be treated as an addict in withdrawal. But she was finally all but forcefully removed by Joe DiMaggio about a week later, and then transferred to a hospital that would provide proper care and put her addiction into consideration with her treatment. And of course, first order of business on her release was for Miss Green to directly contact the White House for a check-in with the Prez, as she now called him, presumably to enlighten him of the ordeal or perhaps seek pity. Any postulation of the content of that call on my end, though, would be speculative. She was put through immediately in spite of JFK being quite well occupied planning both the Bay of Pigs invasion as well as the elaborate plot to assassinate Castro, which Johnny Roselli was directly involved in. Unfortunately, both efforts proved to be abject failures, and at the risk of spoiling the story, the Mafia may have resorted to more brutish means when JFK's efforts to get Sam Giancana back in the Havana casino game per the terms of their devil's contract repeatedly fell flat. The annals of dark history would show that many misfired attempts on Castro's life were made in the early 60s under JFK's watch for a number of justifications. It is also said that Marilyn Monroe kept a secret diary, which will come up again, but that its contents, among many other high-level classified plans and issues of national security, was info on the Castro assassination plot as well as the invasion. Marilyn's second task on the mend was to inform Dr. Chris in no uncertain terms her psychology care services would no longer be needed in light of the overkill inpatient psychiatric experience Marilyn Monroe had just endured at Chris's recommendation. Dr. Chris didn't take it particularly well, but also wasn't very surprised. Still wisely knowing she was in need of care, however, Marilyn managed to make frequent trips to the West Coast to meet with Greenson, to focus on getting out of patterns of addiction and self-destructive behavior. And also during her trips out west, she was making plenty of time to have romantic meetups with Frank Sinatra. Often it was said with Joe DiMaggio lurking nearby out of possessive overprotection and jealous impulsivity. Sinatra even gave her a poodle, which Marilyn Monroe nicknamed MAF, short for mafia. Charming. Out of a growing dependency on Greenson, as well as his recommendation for more and more of her time, however, Marilyn soon made her way permanently back to Los Angeles to be near the doctor, whose own ulterior motives are becoming more suspicious, and he now seems to be using his professional relationship to take advantage of Marilyn's physical charms, as well as a possible interest in her proximity to the president from his contacts behind the Iron Curtain. And soon, in spite of now almost daily therapy visits, Greenson finds himself coming up short on being able to monitor Marilyn's every thought and movement throughout the day. Greenson recommends, aka installs, a housekeeper by the name of Eunice Murray, who had the most deep-rooted connections to the Communist Party of anyone we've met so far. Now, I'm not saying Greenson and Murray were some kind of communist sleeper cells from behind the Iron Curtain, but their histories and connections definitely don't imply that they weren't. And if Cold War spy operations were at play, the Kremlin had found a perfect mark in Marilyn Monroe. Greenson disapproved of her frequent visits to Sinatra's, so he arranges for her to move around the corner from him to keep an even closer eye on her comings and goings. And with the help of old chop-livered DiMaggio, she puts a down payment on a 4-bedroom hacienda located at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac addressed 12305 5th Helena Drive in the Brentwood neighborhood of Los Angeles. And if Greenson's grip couldn't get any stronger, he proceeds to assume an almost conservatorship role Jamie Spears himself would take heed to jot notes from. He is now also reviewing all her scripts and making all her important business decisions. So between Greenson's constant meddling and monitoring on the communist side, Sinatra's mafia and Newcomb's Kennedy reports, not to mention the still steady surveillance from J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, Marilyn Monroe has inadvertently set herself smack dab in the middle of a ticking time bomb of intrigue that would sadly prove to be her ultimate undoing. And we will follow that spiral all the way down when we return. Shortly after New Year 1962, the year that would serve Marilyn Monroe the last 8 months of her short life, she finds herself at a party hosted by the Lawfords at their beach house to welcome home Bobby Kennedy, who is returning from a long stint overseas on official diplomatic business. It is said that that party is where Marilyn began to plant the seeds of romantic involvement with Bobby. Marilyn, girl, what are you thinking? The next month, she decides to take a trip back east to visit Joe, who was wintering in Florida with his baseball team, the New York Yankees. White House records also confirm that the President of the United States, JFK, was in Palm Beach at the same time as Marilyn, and they were seen in rooms down the hall from each other on the same floor at the Fontainebleau. And you and I aren't the only ones getting exhausted watching Marilyn go up, down, and all around with this toxic and self-destructive cycle of behavior. J. Edgar Hoover is again perturbed at the on-again, off-again relationships between Marilyn Monroe and the now brothers Kennedy, and they earn themselves a trip to the FBI Director's Principal's office for a stern talking to on the matters of A. their continued involvement with Marilyn Monroe, who is now known to be almost in constant contact with well-known members of the Communist Party, B. their continued friendship with Frank Sinatra and his connections to the mafia, and third, their ignoring of his repeated attempts to get them to be careful. So he gives them, specifically JFK, a sampler plate of exactly what kind of dirt he's been gathering on him since way back in the way back to his affair with a known Nazi spy during World War II, along with some very clear instructions to chiggity check himself lest he proceed to wreck himself. Party is over. Well, almost over. Because, Dad, there's just this one more party that had already been in the books at Bing Crosby's Palm Springs estate. The gathering had actually been planned for Frank's Palm Springs spot, but was moved last minute in part due to Hoover's tongue lashing. Much to Frank's enragement, as he had just remodeled the whole property to be a Camp David West, equipped with Secret Service quarters and a helicopter landing pad. In fact, Frank had exerted so much expense and effort on preparations, and was so pissed when the plans fell through, that he leaned heavily on Kennedy brother-in-law Peter Lawford to plead with them to reconsider letting Frank host. And when he proved unable to do so, Peter Lawford was shunned permanently by Frank Sinatra, and the two never spoke again. It's told Frank much later actually stopped a Vegas performance mid-show when he learned Lawford was in attendance. Anyway, so now it's Bing's Palm Springs. For all the warnings and chiding J. Edgar Hoover had just thrown the way of the Kennedy brothers, JFK was so flagrant and indiscreet about his relationship with Marilyn Monroe at this party that it's often cited, even outside of conspiracy leanings, as the only possible provable time JFK and Marilyn Monroe would have had a chance for intimate relations. That was due to the fact the party was held in conjunction with a political fundraising event, and that gathering was a matter of public record. And it was also widely publicized in the press that Marilyn Monroe was in attendance. But where our story takes place, we will count this as an outlier event, where Marilyn and Jack were overtly brazen and flagrant about their ongoing romance, which by some standards had been going on way before Marilyn Monroe and John Fitzgerald Kennedy were household names to the Cusack Papers love child allegations, dating back to the early 50s. And though she was not holding an official press conference every time she and JFK had a meetup, Marilyn was becoming more and more outspoken and careless about the affair to any friend or acquaintance who would lend even the most moderately inquisitive ear, which, as you've no doubt been expecting, came to a boiling point with the infamous Happy Birthday performance at Madison Square Garden. Though it would prove to be a giant professional and personal pitfall, it's often, if not always, overlooked that Marilyn was very ill for the performance. Not just with addiction and psychological issues, but literally physically sick. Marilyn had picked up a nasty virus shortly after the Palm Springs party, and she was not taking very good care of herself. She had been on and off with the illness, resulting in the more than usual and by now expected attendance inconsistencies on the set of the never-completed film she was working on at the time, Something's Got to Give. But she was not about to miss a chance to perform for JFK in a public setting, so she had to rally and make the cross-country trip. She packed her custom-made $6,000 rhinestone gown, a couple bags of pills, primarily amphetamines, and hopped a very conspicuous helicopter ride from the Fox Studio landing pad to catch a flight bound for New York City, much to the dismay of her cast and crew, who were already consistently disappointed by the diva. The performance would be her second and final live show ever, and her first since the USO show in Korea almost 10 years previous. In addition to the pervasive virus, she'd been chugging champagne and popping uppers to keep her energy going the whole evening, if not the entire trip altogether. Big Pimpin' Peter Lawford was the evening's MC and decided to make a bit out of Marilyn's notorious tardiness. Throughout the evening, he would falsely introduce Marilyn Monroe and then feign ongoing delay when she didn't emerge from the wings. And by the time the big moment had arrived, Lawford jokingly introduced Marilyn as the late Marilyn Monroe. The shtick was completely lost on the Out of It Marilyn, but a very eerie foreshadowing coming from Lawford, considering what was about to transpire in a few short months and Lawford's role in it. Performing in front of 15,000, but to an audience of 1 in JFK, Marilyn Monroe gave her infamous, breathy, sultry rendition of Happy Birthday with a reprise to the tune of Thanks for the Memories that went, "Thanks, Mr. President, for all that you've done, the battles you've won, the way you deal with U.S. Steel and our problems by the ton. We thank you so much." It was way over the top, but Jack made a good sport jest about the performance when giving his thanks to the crowd and nation to the effect of dying happy now that Happy Birthday had been sung to him in such a wholesome manner. And this is just another personal observation, but it's occurred to me rewatching the performance with what I know of the backstory, that the breathy delivery was perhaps a dramatic choice she made to disguise her nerves and drunkenness, but most of all what her illness would have done to a proper projected singing voice. But any way you look at it, this ill-fated performance would prove to be one of the biggest mistakes of her life. First off, it was not received well publicly. The press made no effort to make excuses for Marilyn, and she became what she had always feared, a laughingstock and public joke. Second, she was completely cut off from JFK. Aside from the few moments she'd spend huddled in a corner playfully chatting with Jack and Bobby at the party reception, she would never speak to Jack again. The threat of national security related to his relationship with Marilyn Monroe was one thing, but outright public embarrassment? Well, no, that was quite another. And who knows how Jackie, who of course was not in attendance the fateful night, took it, but I'm guessing not well. And finally, the studio was outright pissed that she had made such a flagrant showing of a cross-country performance trip when she could barely be bothered to drag herself out of bed to support her fellow Something's Gotta Give cast and crew so much as a few times a week for months now. But Marilyn was not unaware of her folly, and always the portrait of resilience would succeed in an effort to prove powerful on set and reclaim her public image and sex symbol status. She enlisted Pat Newcomb to assist with the photo leak scheme in conjunction with a vibrant performance on the nude Something's Gotta Give pool scene. but with her publicity stunt precariously seeming to put her back on the up and up with the public and the press, private matters that had never been fully resolved were about to sink considerably deeper into the darkness. The weekend following the Something's Gotta Give pool scene filming is the first of several more mysterious lost weekends similar to the Misfits' trip to Calneva that were never fully accounted for or explained. Whatever did take place saw Marilyn return to the Something's Gotta Give set by accounts seeming shattered with fear and a shell-shocked behavior when she returned to work. In spite of her mysterious and terrifying weekend, Marilyn was on speed-induced autopilot, and though she could barely stand to get into her limo, she made her way back to the studio in her sweet time, naturally bright and late Monday morning. By the end of the week, her odd and erratic behavior would prove to be the last straw for a studio whose patience and understanding had already been taken full advantage of by the troubled diva. And Friday, June 1st, would see Marilyn Monroe, one of the most celebrated and iconic movie stars of all time, appearing in front of the motion picture camera for the very last time ever. It was also her 36th birthday, with only her own demons to sing breathy and seductively to her. With nothing now to occupy her foggy days and nights, she made a full-time undertaking of harassing the president however she could by frequent calls to the White House, leading to an eventual disconnection of JFK's private line. And when she consistently failed to reach Jack, she began to beat on Bobby's door, as well as the Lawford, Sinatra, or anyone closely or distantly connected. With her career on the rocks and being shut out by the Kennedys and their associates, Marilyn fell deeper and deeper back into the darkness we've seen her held captive to many times before within the course of our tragic tale. When she consistently failed to show for her daily therapy sessions, Dr. Ralph Greenson decided to pay a house call to his neighbor and patient, where he discovered her in a stupor with a 100-degree fever. However Ralph Greenson was motivated outside of Marilyn's health and well-being, he set about putting gears in motion that would attempt again to save Marilyn's career. He took charge with her recovery from the illness, and he then tasked Patricia Newcomb with PR damage control duties for the press that had been detailing Something's Gotta Give being dropped from Fox and Marilyn Monroe Pictures, therefore Marilyn Monroe with it. Also at this time, with the mysterious lost weekend proving ineffective at its presumed effort to again put this larger-than-life woman in a corner with regard to her pursuit of the Kennedys, a very real attempt to discredit and blacklist her seems to be set in motion by the brothers. Employing the assistance of a Hollywood bigwig, if you're ready for this, the Kennedys had become acquainted with in their dealings with U.S. Steel, the very people she sang about in her disastrous Madison Square Garden's Happy Birthday reprise would become the architects of an effort to end the one thing that had seen her from a faded life of an ex-orphan street waif to the larger-than-life empowered woman she'd become, her career. But in spite of her raw state, Marilyn Monroe, the fight-back and comeback queen, came in hot to save the one thing that could truly see her through the darkness. And without the help of Greenson, she enlisted some powerful old-school players of her own to perform a corporate power-grab stock coup, the likes of which the characters in the HBO hit show Succession would be proud of. It's a show about intricate corporate power grabs. Marilyn Monroe was narrowly able to walk away with promises from the studio that Something's Gotta Give would pick back up, with her as the star. Marilyn was filled with a new sense of hope and zeal for the future, and all was right with the world. For now. And if you're sensing a continuous pathological pattern of poor decisions, self-destruction, and revival here, you're not alone. As much as I've condensed and skipped through some of these events, it's not my story, it's hers. And there's a reason it's called a spiral. This is a very real example of what mistreated addiction and mental illness looks like. And having been there myself, as I've mentioned at times before, one of the big reasons I want to learn and tell stories like this to begin with. The many attempts to scare and discredit Marilyn into silence for a fear of an impending disclosure of the many dangerous pieces of information she held had consistently been thwarted. The Kennedy effort at a blacklist and discrediting her had proven inconclusive, but was a moot pursuit now anyhow. But Sam Giancana and the mafia marched to the beat of their own drum when it comes to omerta, the code of silence, and more importantly, they have their own set of standards and methods when it comes to enforcing and ensuring it. So if there's even the slightest whiff someone will talk, well, it usually isn't great. And Sam Giancana had one last trick up his sleeve that would ensure Marilyn wouldn't rat, and it ended up being one of the most sinister and vile of all. So while plans were set in motion by Sam Giancana through Frank Sinatra to ensure Marilyn was going to keep her mouth shut about all the things she knew and saw, the Kennedys also made one last-ditch effort to double back on their many inconclusive efforts to ensure the same, which predictably backfired spectacularly when now surrogate messenger Bobby, wrong guy for the job, found himself within the throes of what was once a pedestrian-heavy flirtation at minimum to a now torrid affair with Marilyn. Surveillance and confidential informants had disclosed the existence of the secret diary Marilyn kept. Included in the dangerous documentation were many detailed encounters of meetings with both brothers, as well as accounts of the things they discussed during the trysts. Pertinently, matters of national security, including the hydrogen bomb tests, Cuban relations, and mafia involvement in the election. And why, might you ask, would Marilyn Monroe keep a written record of such grave matters? To collect blackmail materials in order to manipulate the brothers into continued romantic relations at the threat of their reputations? Because she was working as a covert Russian spy through the communist contacts in her own home and the confidential environment of her psychiatrist's office? A close friend who became aware of the diary later stated that it was actually none of the above. Heartbreakingly, the reason she recorded this subject matter was so that she could later research and come back to Robert in specific with something smart to say about the politically intricate topics. He had apparently often criticized the actress for not remembering such things or having much to add with regard to issues of international importance that could have been fodder for a top-secret presidential daily brief. That's why. She wanted to provide lively, intelligent, and useful conversation to these men she was infatuated with, so they found her to be useful and unique and not just a lovely blonde head next to them in a bed. Not a sinister plot to bring about the end of capitalism, to take over the world, or even to hold their raisins in a jar. At least until she was brutally stripped of any leverage or personal empowerment in these tricky relationships that would soon prove to backfire tragically on her. Here will bring us to the absolute lowest of low points, save the tragic ultimate culmination we're all anticipating with the end of Marilyn's story. Experiences like what's about to transpire, unfortunately, are not unique to our ears or relegated just to Marilyn's narrative. But the effects on her female and sexual empowerment I do find to be particularly tragic and detrimental to the vulnerable mental state that has already been so tenuous throughout this looping entire chain of events. All things precarious to Marilyn's fragile equilibrium at the crux of U.S. government and mafia collaboration would come to a head one ill-fated weekend, with a return back to Frank Sinatra's Lake Tahoe Cal Neva Lodge. Again, accounts are dodgy and contradictory here, and the true story will likely never be known. But the general breakdown, as I've been able to piece together, goes a little something like this. Frank had convinced Marilyn to join him and Dean Martin, who had also been working on Something's Gotta Give, for a weekend celebrating things again being back on an upswing, with the announcement of Fox's continuation of the project. And the career revival, narrow blacklist escape, and renewed confidence and accomplishment that would be implied for Marilyn with it. The invite was also predictably particularly incentivized for Marilyn, as Frank also conveyed the news that Jack, Bobby, and maybe even Kennedy patriarch Joe himself would be joining the festivities, and a smashing time was guaranteed for all. Marilyn was tentative to return to the dark Misfits-era memories of Cal Neva, and the mysterious accompanying trauma associated with the ominous Black Lodge. But she was also powerless to decline a chance to, at minimum, seek some kind of closure from the brothers who had completely extinguished all communication with their respective old flame. Those unfortunately were not the only guests of honor or disrepute on the list that also had Sam Giancana and Johnny Roselli, as well as a bevy of associated gangsters penned in. And as I foreshadowed earlier, Sam Giancana and the Mafia don't take kindly to any threat of exposure. So with the news of the diary and rumblings of a potential press conference Marilyn Monroe had haphazardly floated to friends and acquaintances in unguarded moments of lowered inhibition and frustration with the failed affairs and being dropped like so much cumbersome bad luggage as a result, the organized crime element of our axis of evil had much more ominous veiled plans for the falsely advertised get-together. Their grand scheme was to get a room heavily wired for video and sound, and snag Marilyn Monroe, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and Bobby Kennedy in a threesome. ripping a page right out of the KGB handbook and providing them with an unparalleled piece of compromise to manipulate and control the trio through potentially reputation-shattering blackmail. Marilyn Monroe was transported in a limo to Frank Sinatra's private jet. Peter Lawford, the self-proclaimed high-class pimp to the stars and influential politician who was experiencing inexplicable marital difficulties at the time, joined her on the flight from Los Angeles to Tahoe. As the weekend got fired up, fueled by booze by the gallon and pills by the handful, the ratpack remnants and a crew of organized crime who's who mingled with Maryland movie moguls and politicians alike. Perhaps tipped off by Hoover, or perhaps just sensing the potentially malicious nature of the party, the Kennedys backed out at the last minute. They were instead replaced by a very unexpected guest who came knocking. Joe DiMaggio, who had a jealous sixth sense fired up for when Marilyn was in peril or at risk of being taken advantage of, was turned away entry by Frank himself on a few separate occasions, but is said to have lurked around the perimeter like a pacing guard dog for the duration of the weekend. Having had their ideal compromise plan foiled by the cancellation of the Kennedy attendance, Frank Sinatra and Sam Giancana would not be left unsatisfied at the easing of their exposure concerns, and they came up with one last wicked plot to obtain the blackmail materials that would ensure Marilyn's silence. Being gradually encouraged, if not forced, to consume copious amounts of booze and narcotics, in a state of drunken disarray and confusion, Marilyn was lured to a room full of ravenous gangsters, including handsome Johnny Roselli and this peach of a guy we'll talk more about later named Gianni Russo. And in the presence of, but so help me hope against hope, not the participation of, Frank Sinatra himself, the men proceeded to, at minimum, repeatedly sexually assault and photograph Marilyn Monroe in a number of unspeakable degrading acts. It said she was passed out for the bulk of the ordeal, which included a disgusting image alleging to have entailed Sam Giancana bridling and riding Marilyn like a horse. By the time the salacious and degrading photographic materials had finally been personally hand-delivered to Frank Sinatra about a week later, it was already too late to hold them over Marilyn Monroe's by then deceased head, and he ordered all the traces destroyed, rendering this most incredibly humiliating experience for Marilyn moot to even its wicked intentions and motivations to keep her quiet. When they had all finished having their foul and filthy on-camera fun, it was said Marilyn was seen swaying vacantly by the pool and staring up at a nearby hill in helpless disbelief at an equally helpless to intervene Joe DiMaggio, who had been vigilantly pacing outside the fence boundary of the facaded torture camp. Joe would never again see Marilyn Monroe alive, but would exert his long-anticipated wishes to possess her by controlling every minute detail of her funeral. From the disinvitation of her massive Hollywood network of friends and associates he'd always despised, all the way down to the outfit and wig she wore in her coffin. Just in case you were looking for a potential knight in shining armor in Joe DiMaggio. When Marilyn finally touched back down in Los Angeles, she rushed barefoot down the tarmac to her waiting limo and was finally returned home, where she would never fully wash away the shame and indignity that had robbed her of her hard-fought empowerment and conquering of her sexuality as a cheap commodity. Lawford's driver later reported that he insisted on an unplanned stop at a payphone several blocks from the Lawford home for a 20-minute phone call we can corroborate was placed to Bobby Kennedy himself. White House phone records verify Bobby Kennedy received an 18-minute phone call from Peter Lawford on the morning of Monday, July 30th. Justice Department records also indicate that Marilyn Monroe placed a call to Bobby later that day, but only Hoover's ever-present elephant ears of surveillance will know exactly what was said between the two there. For obvious reasons, Marilyn exhibited some disturbed, erratic, and generally nonsensical behavior throughout the next week, which was plagued with anxiety and night terrors. She did express to some close to her a crippling fear of the mafia, and seemed to lay some framework to randomly encounter both John and Bobby personally in the near future. For example, purchasing tickets to a New York City musical it was rumored Jack and Jackie would be attending the next month, as well as seeking out mutual contacts who would be able to provide any kind of information on the also eventually tragically fated brothers. Frankly, having experienced and seen friends in the distantly comparable throes of mental illness and addiction lows, there is really no sense to be made of the impulsivity and unwitting, unpredictable behaviors. But it is worth noting in this case that she did not succumb to her normal pattern of self-isolationism and was very active in whatever the hell she thought she was doing. You can find her last interview, primarily in its entirety on the subject of fame, on YouTube, and it's absolutely gutting knowing what she was going through at the time. Some mistook her mania for a renewed sense of confidence, and others, including the Lawfords and her psychologist Dr. Greenson, noted she was pale, unhealthy, and disturbed throughout the course of the week. Marilyn was also putting together plans to curb Greenson and Newcomb, who she had finally recognized as parasitic and unnecessary influences, though it's unclear if she was fully aware of the extent of their behind-the-scenes associations and in-house spy-like surveillance activities. But I do give her credit for recognizing their blood-sucking behaviors, whatever the case. Newcomb seems to have been installed almost as a bulwark to report back to the Kennedys, both through the Lawfords and directly back to Bobby. And though Marilyn Monroe and Newcomb were not getting along and argued about subjects unknown, even to the keen ears of housekeeper Eunice Murray, Newcomb was keeping Marilyn plush with pills, and would often crash in the telephone room across from Marilyn's bedroom where she could be privy to eavesdrop on Marilyn's frequent late-night calls. Often frantic, repeated attempts to reach Bobby in particular, in spite of all the various shutouts and advice against. In fact, as the years would play out, Newcomb would become somewhat of a personal assistant and confidant to the Robert Kennedy family, perhaps out of trust and reward for the diligent spycraft and her role in what was about to transpire in Marilyn's story. And now, friends, our occasionally beautiful but entirely perilous journey adrift the rough seas and traversing the cliffy mountain passes of the life of Normajeane Baker, orphan number 3463, Marilyn Monroe's life, leads us to that tragic, fateful, and historically amiss day of August 4th, 1962. Now, there are about as many completely different and contradictory accounts of this day as there are fish in the rough seas we've just been braving. So I'm going to do my level best to present a linear and straightforward account of how the events may have logically transpired in my own personal opinion. I wasn't there, I haven't talked to anyone who was, I'm just a guy in a room with a mic who's been marinating in the story for the better part of a month now. And here's what I've come up with, propped up by sources. The day begins normally enough in the dry Santa Ana heat of the Brentwood neighborhood of Los Angeles. Marilyn awoke around 6 a.m. to recount to one of her staff members about a series of calls throughout the night, threatening her to leave Bobby alone from a female caller she suspected may have been Ethel Kennedy. Newcomb would remain crashed out in the room across from Marilyn's for some time yet. Eunice Murray, who had not lodged at Marilyn's the previous evening, arrived around 8 a.m., driven by her brother-in-law and handyman Norman Jeffries, who also had a few tasks at hand for the day around Camp Monroe. Jeffries notes seeing Marilyn very pale and frail-looking around 9 a.m., as though she were very troubled and had not slept. It was noted by Murray that though she did fix Marilyn some breakfast, all she had was juice, and furthermore it was recounted by Murray she believed Marilyn did not eat or drink even liquor that whole day. Marilyn then made some calls to some random friends, one of whom noted she had plans to see Bobby Kennedy later that day. We know Bobby Kennedy was in LA Saturday, August 4th, as the FBI had informed the LAPD of his presence, since they are wont to keep track of things like the whereabouts of the Attorney General of the United States. Additionally, Eunice Murray admitted back in 1983 that Bobby Kennedy had indeed been in town and visited Marilyn Monroe on August 4th, 1962, along with some other shocking accounts and corroborations of what's shortly to come. Fox Security reports a helicopter landing around 11 a.m. and the Attorney General rushing to a gray limo waiting nearby. As the day progresses, Marilyn seems to get increasingly agitated, and there are reports of a very short fuse and a couple arguments between she and Newcomb, as well as she and Murray in the early afternoon. And Murray was actually let go of Marilyn's employ during one of these bouts, and of course brought her dismissal woes immediately to the attention of Dr. Greenson, who would also now begin to play a key role in the day. Robert Kennedy arrived at Marilyn Monroe's Brentwood home on 5th Helena Drive between 3 and 4 p.m., accompanied by Peter Lawford, who ran into the departing Murray and Jeffries. When Eunice told Lawford she had just been let go, Lawford pulled out a few bucks from his pocket and suggested they instead just run to the store and grab some Cokes and return a short while later. Everyone knew Marilyn Monroe was unwell and unstable, and nobody seemed to be giving her overreactionary behavior much credence. Concluding one of the earlier arguments I mentioned, Newcomb was told by Marilyn she was no longer welcome in the home, but seems to have forgotten to vacate, rendering her present on the arrival of Kennedy and Lawford. By the time Jeffries and Murray returned with the cokes, the car Kennedy and Lawford had arrived in was gone. They entered the residence to find a very upset and terrified Marilyn Monroe, who, according to Jeffries, was having a hysterical rage. It was like nothing I'd ever seen, he was quoted to have said. She was scared, and at the same time she was terribly angry. And Newcomb was knelt down at her side, making a genuine attempt at comfort, according to the recently returned witnesses. Nothing of permanent record seems to have ever been entered regarding the fate of the cokes. And of course, in light of Marilyn's unhinged state, coupled with her current feelings toward both Murray and Newcomb, she was inconsolable, and Murray made an emergency call to Greenson. Another friend of Marilyn's corroborates this turn of events, recalling a call from Marilyn late in the afternoon. He remembers that she was in a state. She was in tears, and I had difficulty understanding her. After I calmed her down, I asked, "What's the matter here?" She said Bobby Kennedy was here, and he threatened me, and he screamed at me, and he pushed me around. She was afraid, and she felt she was in terrible danger. In a quickly suppressed 2020 interview, P.I. Fred Otash stated that audio surveillance substantiates the account. Quote, "Marilyn and Bobby had a violent argument that moved from room to room," he said. "She told him, 'I feel used, I feel passed around.' The voice of Bobby is said to have been recognized on the recording, saying over and over, 'Where is it? Where is it?' And a third, more calm male voice, presumably Lawford, saying, 'It's important to the family, we can make any arrangements you want,' with Marilyn replying she felt like a piece of meat. It's unclear to me who commissioned P.I. Otash and the resulting surveillance or where the tapes ended up. But the "it" referred to on these recordings can most likely be assumed to be the diary. So that's my best approximation of what transpired when it was just Lawford, Kennedy, and Marilyn in the house, before Murray and Jeffries returned with the cokes and Eunice called Greenson. I'm guessing Newcomb's trauma and loyalties have kept her silent on the exact turn of events from her eyes. Timeline indicates Greenson arrives about 4:45 p.m. Once Greenson arrives, he immediately intravenously sedates Marilyn because, of course, it can be safely assumed that her whole problem is just that she hasn't had enough drugs throughout the day, right? Good on you, Doc. But it does seem to do the intended trick, and Marilyn manages to back down from her crippling fear and rage. And Marilyn and Greenson retreat to her bedroom to undoubtedly work through the details of the trouble in private. Upon Greenson's return to the remaining 3 shell-shocked guests, he turns to Newcomb and charges, "Are you leaving, Pat?" Probably as a result of Marilyn's disclosure of their falling out, and her wishes that Patricia Newcomb not be welcomed in her home anymore. Newcomb immediately and without a word of protest or defensiveness gets up and walks out, knowing full well what he's talking about. Newcomb then makes her way to a dinner at the Lawfords Marilyn was also invited to, stating Marilyn won't be coming along because she's not feeling well. Good looking out, Pat. It also later comes out that the conversation in the bedroom back at Helena Drive resulted in Greenson's dismissal as her therapist, but noting her state of disturbance, he took her no more seriously than anyone else had throughout the day. He told her they could talk more about it on Sunday. That follow-up refiring never took place, and Greenson was still well equipped to inflict more harm on Marilyn, as we'll see. Before he departs, he provides her with some sleeping pills and instructs Jeffries and Murray to stick around through the night and keep an eye on her. In her chemically induced state of calm euphoria, she makes a handful more calls to some random friends, including Joe DiMaggio Jr., who shockingly noted nothing out of the ordinary about the conversation that primarily entailed him stressing out about his girlfriend. And another call to her date at the Golden Globes earlier that year, Jose Bolaños, who said Marilyn revealed information about an impending press conference as early as that coming Monday, and he is quoted to have said, "Marilyn told me something that will one day shock the world." As Bolaños was in hot water with Hoover over his, you guessed it, deep communist contacts, he had actually been turned confidential FBI informant. I want to put a particular weight on this conversation that's perhaps often overlooked, because his surveillance status as well as Marilyn's would have assuredly had both of their phones tapped. Speculatively, if Marilyn was to have told Bolaños something like, "Bobby hit me and I'm going to hold a press conference about it Monday," well, we can only imagine what a sense of urgency that may have created for the ever-listening powers that be. She is also said to have called Lawford around this time, which he only has about 3 different versions of content and timeline for through the years. One of which includes Marilyn Monroe telling him to, quote, "Say goodbye to the president for me and say goodbye to yourself because you're such a nice guy." And then she dozes off without hanging up the phone. Right. I personally think this may be BS concocted by Lawford to sustain a certain narrative that will become clear in a moment, but only the archives of hermetically sealed classified surveillance may ever know for sure. Anyway, by most accounts, the calls to those who knew Marilyn to be upset earlier had her feeling much better, and the folks unaware of the events of the day had nothing disturbing to note, save the powder keg of information allegedly imparted to Jose Bolaños, and one other call to a close friend of Marilyn's that had her sounding nervous and afraid. Shortly after sunset, 3 men were seen to walk up Helena Drive. Some neighbors playing cards noted that one of them happened to be none other than the Attorney General of the United States. A horse-grinned mug not easily mistaken, especially at this time in American history. The 2 others would never confidently be identified, but dealer's choice from the knowledge of the situation includes options of mafia henchmen, FBI/CIA/Secret Service spooks, or even Bobby's own private security, or, some say, off-duty LAPD. One of them appeared to be carrying what witnesses described to look like a leather doctor's bag. After a commotion at the front door that was not described as knocking, Jeffries and Murray were met by Bobby and 2 other men they did not recognize. Once again, in no uncertain terms, Murray and Jeffries were instructed to get lost, but this time at the direct behest of the Attorney General of the United States, who did not provide spare pocket change for cokes. And sensing something was terribly awry, this time they did leave the house but hung out nearby. Now, I'm sure you, as much as I, are at a complete loss as to why a man of such grand political stature would be in physical attendance and association with what was about to happen, and one can only venture the wildest of guesses. Was it to come into personal possession of the fabled and all-important diary? Was it out of vindictive and frustrated malice, or even pure evil? No matter what intentions or motivations were behind it, Robert Kennedy, according to the unfolding of the events related to our story, at this time presumably stood by idly as one of these black-cloaked thugs proceeded to inject legendary icon of movies and mankind, Marilyn Monroe, with enough barbiturate to kill 15 people. And though obviously no one will ever know exactly what transpired in those few moments, Marilyn Monroe fell completely unconscious, and Bobby Kennedy proceeded to complete whatever malicious mission he had come for, assuming that wasn't the intended mission itself, giving the Attorney General a broad benefit of the doubt. Murray and Jeffries witnessed the 3 men leave, though it was unclear if they were carrying any personal belongings of Marilyn's, including the diary, but that was of low importance at this time. And when they saw their way clear of the dreadful crew, Murray and Jeffries rushed back to the house, where the dog was barking inconsolably and uncontrollably. It was in the guest cottage they found an unconscious and unclothed Marilyn draped across the daybed, purple and lifeless looking, but with a very faint pulse and shallow breath. Murray puts out a call to an ambulance and Greenson, but oddly and unexpectedly, it was actually Newcomb and Lawford who showed up before. The EMTs were dispatched by a company called Schaefer, and a young paramedic by the name of James Hall began to work on Marilyn. He's almost completely hindered in his duties by a hysterical Newcomb who's quite nearly wedging her way between Marilyn and the medic. As he's performing CPR, Greenson barges through the door and rushes to Marilyn, effectively shooing away the paramedic effort. Recognizing immediately that he's a doctor, her doctor, the paramedics follow ranks and readily comply. At this time, Greenson withdraws an adrenaline syringe a la Pulp Fiction, but instead of piercing her breastplate and delivering the much-needed revival, the paramedic notices Greenson has in fact jammed a rib, completely missing the vital target. And the life-saving effort, now likely botched, would forever remain unclear as an intentional termination, a flustered fumble, or perhaps an inexperienced mistake. But any way it can be sliced, the error yielded tragic results at around 10:45 on the night of August 4th, 1962, because for all the strength, personality, humor, and charisma Marilyn Monroe had expressed and extended so open-handedly to the world through her work, relationships, and mere existence, for all the beauty and love she had imparted to every life she came across, this would prove to be the last human interaction she would ever experience with another person. We can only take small comfort in the fact she was probably far too intoxicated to notice. Marilyn Monroe then stopped breathing. "Goodbye, Normajeane. Though I never knew you at all, you had the grace to hold yourself when those around you crawled." And though I do want to pin this as the effective ending of our story, because my intention here has always been to humanize this larger-than-life iconic idol of a goddess and portray her personhood, as well as provide a complete account of her life while hopefully doing it justice in the process. But I will continue to take a few minutes to unfold some of the remaining events of this now irreversibly black night, as well as briefly bullet point some of the key details of the cover-up before we leave each other and put this one to bed for the time being. In the wake of the shock and bewilderment of what's just occurred, our 5 remaining shell-shocked onlookers witness a bevy of activities seemingly out of nowhere as plainclothes officers and medical officials descend upon the house. Neighbors notice sounds of a helicopter hovering overhead, as well as a flurry of activity behind the gates of the home and on the surrounding few streets. My personal theory, based on the information I have, is that this was a cleaning crew dispatched by a listening Hoover through the local FBI and LAPD, and this was also where Marilyn's body was relocated to her bedroom and the suicide plot was concocted and relayed with instructions to the witnesses, which they held fast to for many years to follow, until they didn't. And just as quickly as they'd arrived, the cleaning crew was gone. Shortly before midnight, a black Mercedes-Benz was pulled over speeding east on Olympic Boulevard in Beverly Hills. Officer Lynn Franklin approached the vehicle slowly and directed his searchlight to the 3 vehicle occupants. He recognized the driver to be actor and former ratpacker Peter Lawford. One of the men in the backseat he had never seen but identified later as Dr. Ralph Greenson. The third had an unmistakable face, even more so than Lawford, and was immediately recognized by Franklin to be none other than the Attorney General of the United States, JFK's brother, Robert Kennedy. The officer graciously reminded the driver Lawford that he was speeding through a 35 and to be careful with his irreplaceable load of human cargo, and made his way back to his patrol car with a quick tip of the cap. Around 3 a.m., now many hours from when Marilyn passed, the in-house cover-up crew snaps back into action, and an LAPD officer was dispatched to the Helena Drive residence. He was told Marilyn Monroe was discovered deceased by Newcomb, suddenly again hysterical over Marilyn's suicide. The officer immediately notices many inconsistencies that would normally be associated with a suicide, including that there was no drinking glass, either Marilyn's preferred champagne or even for water, for which someone would employ to ingest a lethal amount of pills of any kind. By the time Marilyn's body makes it to a Dr. Noguchi, the coroner slated to perform the autopsy, who also performed Bobby Kennedy's autopsy in an odd twist of fate, it is confirmed that Marilyn Monroe had absolutely no traces of pill casing or crystalline residue, nor anything else in her stomach, among many other pieces of forensic evidence that contradicted the story imparted by the in-house resident witnesses. As the weeks and years went by, there would be a layered and ongoing comedy of errors, with 1 step forward and 2 steps back depending on what corrupt officials were stepping. Suffice to say, Marilyn Monroe's death has never been investigated as a murder and still remains labeled the unorthodox designation of apparent suicide. And that was only about 1 million years ago, so anyone who might have an inside track is probably long gone anyhow. I mean, this was an ill-fated crew to begin with. Greenson would wither to a mere stick figure of a person riddled with guilt and regret over his relationship with Marilyn. Lawford would end up crawling into the business end of a bottle, never to return. Bobby was assassinated with his run for president in '68. Giancana was shot in the eye by other gangsters in a power play. Handsome Johnny Roselli disappeared about 14 years to the day of when he assaulted Marilyn, and was found strangled a few days after the 14th anniversary of her death. And of course, JFK was shot in Dealey Plaza a little over a year after Marilyn Monroe had her date with fate. Which leaves me with one last loose end to tie up. A real peach of a connected guy who actually played a character so sleazy in The Godfather he was hated by the other gangsters in the movie. His character was named Carlo Rizzi, and his real name is Gianni Russo. A few years ago, he released a tell-all about his life rubbing elbows with many of the people we've talked about. In the book and subsequent promotional appearances, he tells of knowing Marilyn Monroe, corroborates Bobby's involvement in her death, and gives, let's just say, a counterpoint version of his role at Cal Neva. He also tells a tale of a gangster hidden in a storm drain near the Dealey Plaza grassy knoll. Rizzi says this was the guy who landed the kill shot on JFK that fateful day and was none other than our demon totem who showed up at some of the darkest points of our story, John Handsome Johnny Roselli. So, Agent Cooper, I hope this has served to satisfy some of those nagging curiosities of yours. And looking at what we've learned, it may have actually behooved you to know a little bit more about Marilyn Monroe heading into the Laura Palmer investigation. because the coincidences don't stop with the male lover archetypes of the obsessed parasitic psychologist, the musician, the athlete, the crime boss, the sensitive writer, and the male personification of pure evil that was just waiting for its chance to use Laura all up until there was nothing left. And learning what I've learned, I have no choice but to think Lynch and Frost ripped some of their inspiration for Twin Peaks right out of Marilyn Monroe's story. And what a story it was. Closing this one down is a little bittersweet for me and makes me a little nervous because I know there's something important I left out or really wanted to impart. I went into it probably like many, knowing Marilyn Monroe had some rough times but having no idea of the extent. Marilyn Monroe was a beautiful, multifaceted gem of a woman and human person. She still shines polished bright for all the world to see from afar. But if you get up close, you begin to see all the cracks and flaws that, at least for me, just add to her uniqueness and completeness as a person. Because like I said way back at the top, this isn't a story about heroes and villains. Real people make good decisions and bad decisions and do good and bad things every day. Marilyn Monroe's life wasn't a movie, and she wasn't a character. She was funny, but she hated being trivialized or made into the butt of a joke. She was sexy and loved her womanhood, but she hated being turned into an object. She was a person. And though that sounds so obvious, I think it's an easy thing to lose in her behemoth persona. So the next time you're in an antique store and you come across a mug that has some half-assed illustration of her getting her white dress wafted upward, just for a moment, think about what that memory and experience meant to her if she were looking at the same image. When you see a postcard of her striking a sexy pose, maybe think, there is a person carrying a torch for all the millions out there so consumed by crippling mental illness that they need to self-medicate however and whenever they can just to get a moment's peace. Just for a minute. You don't have to dwell on it or let it take you to a dark place, but just for a second, say, Marilyn, you are a person. And I think she'll feel it. And maybe her troubled soul can get some rest and peace too. And if you are one of the people Marilyn Monroe is carrying that torch of solidarity for, especially after these last few years of pandemic, or maybe you know someone who's in a very dark place that they just can't seem to rise above. Maybe they've had a traumatic physical or sexual experience, or deep issues with addiction, or maybe they're just tangled up in an endless net of depression and anxiety. I truly and sincerely want you all to know that it just takes one step toward help. One rung of the ladder to start to make your way up out of the pit. And once you do, you'll start to remember the things you love about yourself and life. The things that fuel your soul, like stone fruit season, or a snuggle with your dog or kids, or maybe a Marilyn Monroe movie marathon with a close friend. Because that's where life happens. Not in your failures or fears. And sometimes that rung of the ladder is just a simple conversation. So if you need to call the suicide prevention hotline at 800-273-8255, or the sexual assault hotline at 800-656-4673, or the substance abuse and mental health hotline at 800-662-4357. They're trained to help you start that ascent. And there are so many anonymous resources even online if you don't love talking on the phone. There is always hope, even when it seems impossible, and I wish you my very best, and support you all the way in finding your first rung of your personal ladder. Dear friends, thank you so much for going on this deep dive into the life of Marilyn Monroe with me. One of my biggest goals of the show is to really humanize these struggles that many people go through, including myself, in hopes that someday we can really get beyond the stigma and barriers that actually keep people from getting help or being able to talk about this stuff. We've come a long way since Marilyn's Day, but there's still more work to be done. Along with tons of online articles and videos, particularly Marilyn's late interviews and ones pertinent to these events themselves, my primary source was a book called The Last Days of Marilyn Monroe by Donald H. Wolfe, who, in my opinion, did a great job of not only seeking first-hand accounts, but also compiling and citing the many parties involved in the intricate and incendiary tale. Thank you all again for listening and giving it some thought, care, and energy. I went just a tad longer than the window I usually like to take with our time together, because there was a lot to be told to do the story proper. I always appreciate you keeping in touch with your ideas, feedback, and questions at nowyouhearpod@gmail.com, as well as keeping an eye on what we have going on in the socials at nowyouhearpod on Instagram and Twitter. So if I don't hear from you, I'll see you back here in 2 weeks. And in the meantime, as always, believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see.